I'm going to talk a bit about the power of place. Of course, this is one today. And I think you all experienced about a year ago the power of place when you gathered together, many of you, in the square and stood up for some things you really believed in. And today I'm going to focus a bit more on the power of smaller places and places where people who want to share a particular environment can gather together and experience what it means to innovate together. About 2 years ago, my good friend and business partner, David Belt, he called me, and I was in my studio in Manhattan editing a feature film that I'd been working on, something I had shot in Antarctica. And David called me and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm working." He said, "Well, I'm standing in a kind of remarkable building in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Would you come out and take a look at it with me?" So I did what any good friend and partner would do. I got on my bike and I rode across the Manhattan Bridge. Now, David was standing inside of this building. So David is the kind of person who is just obsessed with repurposing old structures. He's a real estate developer who really cares about bringing back historical buildings. He's done this in Rome and in Paris and all over Manhattan. And when people in the city think about who they would want to bring into an environment to help reimagine what can happen there, they often call David. And I guess I'm that friend and person that he calls when he's got a puzzle to solve, something that there's not an obvious answer. So I rode my bike across the Manhattan Bridge about 15 minutes to a place I'd actually never been. I've always seen it from the outside across the river. There's this enormous yard. It's 130 acres, a compound with 3 gates that sits between 2 burgeoning areas of Brooklyn, Dumbo and Williamsburg, where really all of the creative class has moved to and where there's a tremendous amount of just activity and innovation happening all around Brooklyn in those areas. And the Brooklyn Navy Yard is kind of an amazing place because at the turn of the century, there were about 60,000 people working in this 130-acre compound. About 15, 20 years ago, there were about 200 people working there. And right now, there are around 6,000 artists, entrepreneurs, engineers, designers tucked away in buildings all around the Navy Yard that are doing kind of pretty amazing things. So when I got there, I found David inside this building. And I have to admit that I too walked in and was awestruck by what felt like a cathedral for manufacturing. It was just an enormous space. But in fact, this space was the crown jewel of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And what had happened in the Brooklyn Navy Yard at the turn of the century and through the world wars was an enormous amount of innovation happened there. In fact, all the major ships that anyone in America can remember were built in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and really the major parts of them put together inside this building. This building was home to the state-of-the-art of manufacturing in its heyday. There were amazing things happening there. And so when David and I began talking inside this inspiring space, we really started wondering, well, if that was the state-of-the-art of manufacturing then, what is it today? What does it look like? Not just what are the technologies, but how are people working that makes it the state-of-the-art today? And honestly, there really couldn't be 2 less qualified people to ask this question. But somehow, we felt inspired to ask it and to pursue the idea. We were actually moved by the building and moved by the possibility of what we might do together. So what we decided to do was continue to talk with the Brooklyn Navy Yard about the possibility of transforming the building and to just ask the question of everyone we knew. And we know a lot of people that have graduated from MIT and RISD and migrated from different companies, and they're all parked all over Brooklyn growing small companies. And actually, that night, I went home, and I had a trip scheduled in a couple days from then to come to Europe. And I just started researching technologies that some I knew about, some I was interested in. And honestly, I'd always been incredibly passionate about the role design plays in solving problems. As a photographer and filmmaker, I've traveled quite a bit, and I've gotten involved in quite a few enterprises as an investor and a partner with people that had very simple solutions for what felt like impenetrable, complex ideas of the developing world. So I went home and I started researching things like nanotechnology and what was happening in bio and additive manufacturing and robotics, just kind of obsessively looking into everything. And in the additive manufacturing sector, I kept coming across a guy by the name of Sia Madavi. Everywhere I turned, there was kind of a reference to him and his work and his little logo. And he was based in London. So the next day, I actually called him in London. And I said, look, we're thinking about creating a space, possibly, in Manhattan that we think could be a place to bring together innovators, people working with new technologies, because that was the idea we had kind of contemplated when we were in the building. And Sia started telling me about what he was doing, and it was really kind of blew my mind. He said that, well, no, he wasn't just working in one industry. He was working in aerospace and in footwear and in medical. He was just pretty much touching every industry with his software that he had developed to apply new principles to additive manufacturing. And I was so incredibly intrigued by what Sia was saying that I said, look, I'm going to Europe. Why don't I come through London and meet with you? And I did. I flew to London. I spent the afternoon with Sia. And truly, he was someone that opened up my eyes to the fact that there are technologies that are transforming not just one particular industry, but all industries across the board. And they're not isolated. I mean, Sia came from a robotics background, and he was trying to solve problems with robotics and decided that he really needed to create new principles and design paradigms for additive manufacturing to create the tissue he needed for a robotic snake. And he succeeded in doing that. And when I got home, I was introduced to somebody by the name of Jonathan Sater. I think you heard Tom speak about him today. Jonathan Sater runs this company, BioLight Stove, which is just in Dumbo, adjacent to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And we've been talking with him about being part of what we're going to create in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And what's amazing about this guy is that immediately you feel like you've met the GE of the developing world. You've met a guy who was approaching things totally differently, that saw a problem he wanted to solve, and he set his mind to solving and creating a stove that burns 75, 80% less smoke than a traditional stove that burns either cow dung or wood or whatever fuel source it is. And at the same time, as Tom said, creating power from the heat that would normally have been wasted from the stove. I met people like Matthew Putman, who Peter Thiel, who started PayTrust, calls Matthew Putman a modern-day Galileo, because he truly has built some tools that make the invisible visible, a nanomicroscope. And Matthew is somebody, along with Sia, who are now members of what we have in New York called a Newlab beta space, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a few minutes. We met guys like David Benjamin, who Tom also mentioned. And David's really interesting because he is using computational engineering to solve a lot of problems in the built environment. But of late, he's been merging computational engineering with bio to create structures that are built of living material, bricks that actually were formed in partnership with a company called Ecovative that were formed with root systems. So what we began to discover is that these people are working across disciplines. People like Jessica Banks, who's building kinetic furniture that responds to the environment through sensors, and Ed Jacobs, who's built a parabolic light structure that gathers light through parabolic dish and delivers it through fiber optic to what's going to be an underground park in Manhattan. He's an industrial designer who was designing motorcycles, but someone came to him with a problem to solve, and he set his mind to do it. And Andras Forjaks, who wants to grow leather from cell culture, he's recently moved to New York to start a business growing leather and ultimately meat, and he wants to grow it in Manhattan because he wants to be near the fashion industry. So he's bringing 3D printing, cell culture, and fashion into the same arena. I think you're starting to get the idea, which was that we met literally hundreds of people. And what we realized was that they really were merging different disciplines, and all the disciplines were touching one another and informing one another. But the one really significant theme that I discovered after meeting all these people is that all of them are unemployable. And what I mean is that these people, not for 1 second, are looking for jobs. They don't see institutions and organizations that can accommodate the way they're thinking and the way they're approaching problems. They really are pioneers, and they're trying to create and push the envelope of things that haven't been done yet. And the other thing I discovered is that there's a heck of a lot of them. Like, this is not an incidental thing that we just found some people that might be part of an interesting ecosystem. There are a tremendous amount of people that are discovering the fact that they have access to complex tools, or tools that used to be complex that now a 5-year-old understands. They have access to technologies that were normally siloed inside large institutions, and companies like Autodesk are making them available to everyone through your iPhone or through other distribution facilities. The other things that what we really discovered was that we are facing a new age of manufacturing. And that new age of manufacturing, of course, it's about these technologies. These technologies are really pushing the envelope on every level, and they're blowing our minds of what is possible. But there's something else that became really apparent to David and I, which is that the way people are working together, the way they're seeking out one another, is really as much about the state of the art of manufacturing today as the tools themselves. People are looking for environments where they have absolute flexibility to accelerate their ideas quickly and to work through the ideation and prototype as part of the design process. This was an essential message that we got from everyone we met. They want to prototype over and over and over again and make it part of the design process. They don't want to design something and see it prototyped in China, have it come to them and discover that it's not exactly right. They want it to be an iterative process. And they want to collaborate. They want to collaborate and lean onto other disciplines and see how that informs the process. And really, more so than anything, we discovered that people place a tremendous amount of value on serendipity, on the possibility of what happens when you're around other people and when you run into people. And it reminds me of a story that I read in the Stephen Jobs book, where he talks about when he designed the Pixar headquarters and even the Apple headquarters, he put a tremendous amount of thought into where the bathrooms are. He didn't want people to get to the bathrooms too easily. He wanted them to go away from where they were and to run into people. So he put the bathroom in a place where people could run into each other and have conversations and discourse about what they're up to and what they're doing. And he really believed that that design principle of the space was an important piece of how people might work together. So David and I took all this knowledge back to our studio, and we started thinking about what this building might become. And while we were designing this, we realized that a lot of those people that I showed you in these slides were all around Brooklyn, and even see in London, wanted something now. They were like, let's just start this now. It's going to take 2 years to build that building. So what we did was we created a beta space, the same way software companies create the 1.0 version and test out what they're doing. We decided, let's just do it. There's millions of square feet in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So we took 10,000 square feet. We created a beta space. EOS put a 3D printer in there. Autodesk put some software there. Jessica Banks came with her robotics. Sia Madavi came with his team for doing a lot of software development. We have people developing. Matthew Putman put some of his folks from his nano microscope company there. There's about 30 or 40 people there. And we've spent about a year and a half now learning from these people how they work together, and really the miraculous things that can happen when you put a group of people in a room together. And I think the one thing that distinguishes this differently from a lot of co-working spaces is that we discovered in this bird path we went on that there's a renaissance and a new age of manufacturing before us, and it's very much hardware-centric. I mean, it's not only hardware-centric, software is part of everything, but the Internet of Things and the way things get made and manufactured and the ambition and drive to create relevant products that are focused on solving really big problems around energy and transportation and in the medical fields. It's really happening, and it's happening in a big way. So this space is evolving now. It's under construction. We raised about $23 million from city, state, and private resources, but we got a lot of support from the city and state. And the Navy Yard, in our deal with them, is committed to putting in all the core and shell and building out the building. And what we imagine happening here, what we're designing for, is a combination of studio spaces and co-working spaces. Spaces that companies like BioLight Stove can bring their 40 people and grow the next iterations of their products, but also spaces where guys like Kerem and Engen, when they're in New York, can come and know that they have a co-working space and they have access to all these shared tools. The tools that Tom talked about, the robotics, additive manufacturing, CNC mills, just basic fundamental things that people need, legacy tools and digital tools, so that people that are growing companies that are this steep curve of building something that is relevant, they're not having to invest in all that infrastructure. It's there for them. And as a matter of fact, they have one another as an enormous resource. So this is the type of facility we're going to build, a multidisciplinary co-working environment that's focused on supporting designers, engineers, and entrepreneurs, growing their businesses under one roof. And we hope that they'll outgrow the space as quickly as possible. The other thing that we discovered while we were talking to people, especially talking to companies like GE or design firms in Manhattan, or even people working overseas in Norway and Denmark, was that they wanted to have access to this place, but they didn't want to have access to it all the time. They wanted to have some sort of flexible relationship to the space. So we spent a lot of time and effort polling people, and we felt that if we could give people a way to be there some days a year, or a group of people to be there some days a year, and to use the tools the way any other member would, then that also would add to the mix and flavor of what happens there. And the idea of creating a unit of flexibility so that you could come in with a group of people and work for a month or 3 months, but not have the overhead of being there all the time. So we've created a flex unit, and we've heard from companies like GE and design firms in Manhattan like Smart Design and architects in Denmark and another firm in Brazil that this model of interacting with this ecosystem is important and useful to them. In fact, I'll get back to that. In fact, the other thing that people really appreciate is the fact that although we're creating a safe environment to innovate and to grow IP and to grow products, we also feel events like this and the outward-facing nature of the facility are really important. So we have created an event space in the building so that people can broadcast and share their ideas. So I think in the end, what we feel that we're building and what we're growing with the beta space and with this facility under construction is a place, not for creating something that hasn't happened yet, but a container and an ecosystem for what is already happening, which is really happening all around us. I think this is one of the important last messages that I want to bring home, which is that the fact that you heard from Kerem and Engen about Atelier earlier today, it's not incidental. What we're doing in Newlab and what they're doing here in Istanbul and what folks are doing in Nairobi and in Egypt and Berlin, we're really nodes of a larger conversation. It's really happening. There's really something going on. And it does take a little gumption, like Engen and Kerem have, to just create the place and invite people to come into it. And then I just think it takes the gumption of people to realize that in a city of, 15 million people, there are a tremendous amount of people out there that see problems around them, problems in the city, problems in tools that they're using, and to have an environment where you can go and be around some like-minded people or people that are different than you, that have some skill sets that would help you accelerate your thinking and realize the potential is really an enormous thing, and it's not something to be taken lightly. So I really applaud these guys for doing that. We feel that what's happening here in Atelier with these guys and what we're doing in Newlab are part of a really important conversation, and we're setting the stage for a renaissance in manufacturing that I hope a lot of you will be a part of. Thank you.